In the Second World War, the Japanese were not trusted by the American public. As time passed, the decision to intern the Japanese was made by the American government. To the Japanese, the land of the free had become the land of the damned. Many Japanese Americans were angered by being treated like objects rather than humans, even when they complied willingly with internment. There were 13 internment camps made for Japanese American citizens living in the United States during World War II. One of the internment camps, Honouliuli, is a place that history seems to have forgotten. The history of internment is long and complicated, but to understand the reasons, we have to go back to the beginning. Change comes to all nations. In the early 20th century, the great powers of the time thought things would never change. The United States of America was thought to be one of the greatest superpowers of the world. The Americans at the time enjoyed meeting up with friends, watching a movie, and living the American dream. America cherished its lifestyle and only wanted to continue living it, but the one thing that America feared had begun to emerge: change. The Axis powers of World War II began to grow, conquering nation after nation, army after army. The Axis powers were growing ever stronger, and they soon began to grow so strong that America was getting anxious. The closest Axis country to America was Japan. The Japanese expansion in the Pacific gained the attention of America. Before internment even began, tensions were high as the Japanese Empire was an Axis power in the Second World War. The United States made numerous attempts to stop the Japanese from expanding over Asia and the Pacific, but their pleas for peace fell upon deaf ears. The United States was left with no choice but to cut off Japan from their oil and metal supply. Outraged by the actions of the United States, Japan initiated a plan for a swift and calculated surprise attack on the United States Pacific Fleet. On December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Army launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. After a barrage of hellfire, bombs, and bullets, the Pacific Fleet was crippled. The once proud and prepared Pearl Harbor had become a desolate and ravaged wasteland. For the first time in a long while, America felt threatened and scared. Their flag of red, white, and blue was torn, burnt, and dishonored, while the flag of the rising sun had now become a symbol of fear and uncertainty. Change had finally come to America, and with it, war. Tensions between Japanese American citizens and the U.S. government were at an all-time high. Discrimination and belittlement were a common thing towards any Japanese Americans at the time. Propaganda would be posted regularly, encouraging the hatred towards the Japanese. Eventually, the day came where the U.S. government no longer trusted any Japanese person on American soil. President Roosevelt enacted Executive Order 9066, an order that called for the internment of Japanese American citizens. The U.S. government feared that the Imperial Japanese Army would eventually reach the American mainland, and that the Japanese American citizens living in the U.S. would betray America in favor of their homeland. The day would never come where the Japanese invaded the U.S. mainland, but the U.S. took no risks in the matter. Through the eyes of the average American, the Japanese Americans were just as evil and twisted as the country they came from. After the order was enacted, Japanese Americans were given a short notice to pack a suitcase and prepare to live in one of the atrocious internment camps scattered across America. Homes that once held Japanese families were sold off after the occupants complied with the law. The families not only lost their homes, but whatever was left behind with it. Furniture, family photos, heirlooms, all lost, never to be returned. The internment camps in Hawaii were irregular from the U.S. mainland because of the large Japanese population on the island. On the U.S. mainland, Japanese American citizens would be picked out of large communities to be interned, but in Hawaii, the Japanese made up most of the community. It was evident that it would be impossible and foolish to intern all local Japanese, so the U.S. military, now acting on martial law, arrested Japanese community leaders and people of importance. The Nisei were second-generation Japanese Americans who were educated in Japan and then moved to Hawaii, never had a say in the matter. Teachers, workers, managers, all hard-working Japanese American citizens that worked for the betterment of America's future were arrested because of the blood that flowed through their veins. Even priests, who openly opposed war and preached for peace, were not safe from internment. The Federal Bureau of Investigation went from house to house, arresting Japanese Americans to be taken to the Sand Island internment camp. The FBI said the arrested Japanese Americans showed signs that they weren't loyal to America, but many would argue that it takes more than ethnicity and being a well-educated person to be proven disloyal. The Sand Island internment camp was opened in December 1941, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Americans that were arrested were to be processed and held in the Sand Island internment camp. Most of the processed Japanese would be unfairly interrogated and labeled disloyal to America. There were even opportunities that arose for the interned Japanese Americans to join the 442nd Battalion and fight in Europe in America's name. But even if they joined, they were still discriminated against before, during, and after the war. The Sand Island internment camp was rushed and made with deplorable materials. The camp was open from 1941 to 1943, until a new camp was created to move all the former Sand Island internees. That camp was Honouliuli. Honouliuli was a very remote location meant to hide its multiple injustices against what the United States Constitution stands for. Built on 160 acres in West Oahu, the conditions were harsh. Most of the internees were not used to the constant manual labor, blistering temperatures, and nutritionally substandard food. The internees were completely at the mercy of the guards that kept them in prison, most of whom were armed sentries. The internees called it Jigokudani, or Hell Valley. Most internees were torn from their families, leaving a hole in family life and their communities. Some 320 Japanese Americans were interned along with 4,000 prisoners of war. Honouliuli was the largest internment camp in Hawaii. Even after Japan had its pride seared away by atomic fire, the camp continued to operate, remaining open until 1946, a year after the war ended. Even after the internees were released, most of them were not trusted by the American public. Finding work was hard, and finding anybody who trusted them was harder. For the Japanese Americans, it just wasn't enough knowing that their homes were taken away by their new country and that their homeland was scorched by atomic fire. Knowing how internment camps, Honouliuli, and the treatment of Japanese Americans impacted history, the very least the modern world can do is learn from the mistakes of the past. America thought its way of life would never change, but change comes to all nations, all people, and all ways of life. The only constant in man's struggle in preserving their way of life is war, because war never changes.